Good morning.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third webinar in our Risk Education series entitled Risk Adequacy, Embedding the Process. As previously, questions or comments can be submitted via the Q&A button on your screen and will be addressed by the presenters at the end of the session. May I introduce your speakers and presenters for today? Firstly, Richard Revill, our risk leader at Complyport.
Good morning.
And leading out the session for today, Gerard Joyce, CTO and Director of Risk Management at CalQRisk.
Good morning.
Over to you, Gerard.
Thank you, Joseph, and good morning all. Today we're going to, today's session is about how to implement, or the last session was how to implement a risk management framework, and today we will look at how to embed the risk and compliance processes in an organization. We're going to do that by first looking at a typical system of management, or management system if you prefer. PlanDoCheckAct is a typical approach to describing a management system, and though you may not call it that in your organization, it will very much describe what you have in place. Then we look and see how you might embed the arrangements for managing risk and compliance into such a management system. And finally, we'll finish on two short checklists, which will consider them as takeaways if you're looking for a short list of things you have to do to embed these. These two slides will confirm that to you. Okay. You don't want and you don't need more than one management system. So I would say build it in. Build in your risk and compliance management into the one system. Don't bolt it on. Okay. Starting with maybe a high-level picture on risk and compliance. I think there are two complementary functions in any organization. And if you consider risk management is forward-looking, it's preemptive, trying to look at what might happen, where the uncertainty is, and trying to reduce that uncertainty and thereby increase the likelihood of achieving your objectives. Whereas compliance tends to be what we're doing today and what did we do last month, last quarter, and did we do what we were supposed to do? It's looking out the back window or the side window of the car, whereas risk management is looking at the front windscreen. But increasingly we're seeing that the FCA is focusing on risk management because yes, non-compliance is also a risk. And if you are hoping that today and yesterday you were compliant, I would say that's where the uncertainty is. Better you're looking forward and anticipating maybe where you might diverge from what you should be doing. So yes, I think compliance becomes more meaningful when combined with the risk management function. And maybe I'll ask Richard to comment on the FCA's maybe stance on this. Richard.
Yes, certainly. Well, the initial trigger for this series of webinars was, of course, the FCA's consultation paper, CP 1920, which was entitled Our Framework Assessing Adequate Financial Resources. And this document actually mentioned risk 136 times. Now, risk and compliance, I feel, and Jerry feels, that these two things fit together very nicely. A good risk framework basically provides good anchors for compliance within the firm. If you simply try to react to the rule book, you're going to get a very disconnected compliance regime, which doesn't really bear a complete match to the internal workings of a specific firm. Basically, in a nutshell, risks give rise to controls, and the controls are assured or checked to ensure compliance. Without the risks, compliance is effectively it stems or runs a risk of becoming a theoretical checkbox exercise. I think that's the way we look at it, and certainly the FCA has been pushing for risk within the compliance function for quite some time now.
Okay. And don't know if you want to mention SMCR at this stage, but certainly certainly senior managers will be looking for that reassurance that the controls are effective. But more on that later. So onto the PlanDoCheckAct system of management. This is I suppose, an acronym, PDCA, that is often used to describe management systems that every organization has, whether they formalize them or not. And I just want to take you through what that looks like, so that you can see how the risk management fits into what is, I think, a typical management system. The first is the context and leadership. This is where it all starts. The context is the organization. Now, certainly ISO management system standards, they talk about understanding the organization, and it's nothing more complicated than, well, what are the objectives of the organization? What's the scope of what you're trying to manage? Is it one operation in the UK, or is it multiple operations in multiple countries? Who are the stakeholders? Regulators, customers, suppliers, employees, and what are their requirements? What do they expect from this management system? And the management system, remember, it could be risk, it could be compliance, it could be quality, it could be health and safety, it could be financial, it could be information security. So the same rules apply, the same description of the context, keep the headings high level. Leadership is just another way of saying, I think, governance. And without governance, the risk management and compliance just will not work. What I expect from leadership, and what certainly the management system standards will have right up there, is policy. You start with the policy. Policy, what do you expect? What are the goals? Who's going to be responsible? How are you going to measure it? All of that. And then you assign people to specific roles and responsibilities, and give them the authorities to do the job. This before you start off. And if you're in that leadership position in the senior management team, you need to ensure that the function, whether it's risk or compliance or information security, is appropriately resourced. Maybe Richard, yes, I was going to say, maybe I'll get you to comment. Just as I read roles and responsibilities, I'm reminded of SNCR.
It's a very good segue on that one. Obviously, SMCR comes in just after the weekend, so it's fairly apposite at the moment. But one of the fallouts from SMCR is that firms will obviously be mapping out the responsibilities and apportioning those between senior managers and certified staff. Now, you and I have often talked about this, Jerry, that the person running the risk management framework should really be regarded as more of an officer or an enabler. The managers within the firm actually bear responsibility for managing risks within their own departments, and the risk officer really collates and rationalizes. But he's not responsible for all the risks across an organization. He is simply the focal point to funnel information in and to effectively curate this. So really, SMCR, by focusing on roles and responsibilities, will either bring clarity or a spotlight, I guess, on these things, depending on your point of view.
Yeah, good comment. I think, yeah, the spotlight is good, and clarity. I like that. Let's move on. So into the PlanDoCheckAct. The first stopping point is the planning, the thinking stage, I call it. You start a new function, be it risk management, compliance, or as I said, information security. It could be any particular function that you're applying the risk management or the management system to. And the first thing you would think of is, well, what can threaten success in this discipline? So you identify the threats and opportunities. You think of actions that you now need to plan to address those threats and opportunities. That is, minimize the threats and optimize the opportunities. You need to think, how are you going to integrate actions and things you need to do into processes? How are you going to measure if this is working? Depending on the scope, there may be a need to implement this in different functional areas, and you will have different functional objectives in the financial department, in the IT department, in the operations department. Think about those, because they will guide your next steps. Who is going to be responsible for I'll talk about risk in a moment, but who's going to be responsible for the function that you want to implement, to manage, and the departmental function responsibilities. What are the processes you're going to need to introduce to the organization, and therefore the training required? You will obviously need to plan to communicate policies and what's expected to people, and give some thought to the documentation required. And often what will determine this is the regulators' requirements. Remember, when the FCA come visiting, they will want to see evidence that you are doing what you say you are doing. So think about that at the planning stage. What documentation is required? What records do you need to keep so that you can show these and demonstrate that you have best practice, good practice? And finally, in setting up a management system for any function, how do you know if it's working? How are you going to measure it, and how will you know that it's achieving what you wanted to achieve? So at the planning stage done, the next is do, check, and act. Do is simply implement it. Do the things that you've planned, implement the processes and record the results. That's simply the doing of it. Checking is checking that the arrangements you've put in place are actually working as expected, that people are doing as you expect. Maybe the training wasn't as effective as you thought. So as you check, you will identify opportunities for improvements, and one might be fixing things that weren't done right in the first place, or it might be that you'll identify ways of doing it better. And the act is acting on those things that you've identified, whether it's people not complying with the rules, maybe it's because they can't, because of causes and things that you didn't identify in the planning stage. So you address those, implement your corrective actions, and you're back to the beginning of the cycle again. That's, in a nutshell, the PlanDoCheckAct system of management. I now want to apply that to a risk scenario. Consider it a risk management system. And again, I will say it's not a second management system, but you're embedding it in your existing management system. It's just another discipline, if you wish. So the context, we look at the organizational objectives, and maybe you augment them with risk management objectives. What do you want to achieve with the risk management function? What's the scope? Is it just one department? Is it operations, or is it all departments? Now, my recommendation would be make it enterprise-wide. Indeed, extended enterprise-wide, which in some quarters this phrase is creeping in the EE or M, i.e. to include your suppliers as well. But you might want to start small, start with the operations, but with an eye to growing this as you achieve a certain capability in risk management. So think of scope and only do what you can realistically manage in the first few months in the beginning. Think of the requirements, what's expected. What is the driver for this? Is it because of regulations expecting it? As a risk expert, I would say it's unfortunate that it takes a regulator to make people do risk management, because I would have said it's good for you anyway. I can give you 7 reasons why you should do risk management, and the regulator is just one of them. But you need to identify what's expected by the regulator, or it could be some contractual obligations that you have, things you've signed up with partners, suppliers, or customers that you now need to manage. Once you understand the organization, policy, to my mind, is the next step. Your risk management policy, and in the policy, I'd be including what it is you want to achieve, why you're doing this in the first place, because the rationale you made to bring people with you in the organization, they want to understand why are we doing this all of a sudden. We were managing just fine up until now. This seems like more work. So you need to articulate that. You need to say in the policy who's going to be responsible, who's the champion, who's going to drive this in the organization, and how is it going to be reported. All of that in the policy. I would include commitment statements in the policy. This is from the senior management team and supported by the board. Things you will do to ensure this happens. So you're setting the tone from the top, as it were. At some point, you have to establish your risk criteria. And very simply, that's the yardstick, the hymn sheet, the criteria you're going to use to evaluate the level of risk. And on the right-hand side here, you'll see a 5x5 matrix. And if something is a 5 in consequence or impact, what does that mean? What does, if you say one word, it's substantial? Well, what does substantial mean? Unless you actually articulate that in a few sentences, maybe what it means for reputation, what it means financially, what it means operationally. 5 different people will have 5 different understandings of what a substantial consequence is. So write that down. And risk appetite, something that is widely misunderstood, but if I can put it in a sentence, it's how much risk are you, the organization, willing to accept in pursuit of your objectives? It's not one statement. It's not one single figure. And it's not a number. It's sentences that say we have 0 tolerance for willful breach of regulations. It's setting limits on the amount of credit you will give somebody. So it's a mixture of, certainly, of words and of numbers. And this is set at the highest level and then disaggregated across the organization. You need to identify, and it is an officer, I agree 100% with Richard, it's not a risk manager or compliance manager, it's an officer. And this might be, depending on the size of the organization, it might be the same person. In some organizations, to keep it separate. But you need somebody who's going to be the champion and lead this and be seen to have the authority and the support of the senior management team. And if you are a member of that senior management team and you are serious about managing risk, then you need to ensure that the appropriate resources are also provided, or it will fail. It will fail because of that lack. Okay, so you've got your policy, you've identified who's driving this, and that person is now going to be the driver of the planning. And as I was saying, in any risk management or any management system, the first step is to think about, well, what could cause this to fail, this program for managing risk? What are the threats? And indeed, what are the opportunities? What are the objectives for the individual functional areas? Risk management objectives might be to reduce the number of complaints, to reduce the number of errors, to reduce outstanding debts through better qualification of who we give credit to. It can be detailed or it can be high level, but have a think about what are you trying to achieve. So how do you know if it's successful? If you haven't written down what the objectives are, you will never know if you're being successful or not. And I would say start by understanding existing processes. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, but understand existing processes and how the work is carried out. You'll be surprised how much risk management you are already doing. You will have controls in place. You will have measurements in place. You will have checks that confirm that the processes are working. Develop a standardized risk assessment process. When I say develop, there are guidelines out there. The 31,000 has a good guideline on what is a standard risk assessment process. The important thing is that you are consistent in applying that process across the organization, whether it's just one functional area or the whole enterprise-wide. Have a standard process. Some people will need training. It might be just a couple of hours, but there is a vocabulary that they may need training on. It's not large. But identify those training needs and train the people. If you don't train them, don't be surprised if they don't deliver the results you expect. And always communicate and consult. You do not know all of the risks in the organization, but the people at the coalface know them probably best. So communicate and consult. Explain the policy. Make sure it's implemented in a consistent way. You need, at the planning stage, to decide on how information will be stored and reported and how it's going to be used in decision making, because that is the real test if you're really doing the risk management for real or just as a tick box. If you're planning a new product introduction, just as an example, Wouldn't it be good to know the experiences to date? How much bad debt are you carrying? How good are you at collecting that debt? That's just one input, but if you're not measuring these things, if you're not controlling these things, if you don't know how good you are at certain things, then how can you make a decision to take more risk? Because when you introduce a new product, for example, you're introducing more risk. So know what you need and know how the information is going to be used. Consider key risk indicators. This is always a good measure. And in terms of risk indicators, there are different types. Now, it's not the scope of this webinar to cover them all, but the two key ones you'll be looking at are stress indicators and failure indicators. Now, a stress indicator might be system downtime. It could be customer complaints. It could be sick days, people off sick days. And this is telling you something that maybe the organization is being stressed and about to break. Failure indicators, on the other hand, are missed targets. Complaints can be a failure indicator as well. Audit findings, policy breaches. If you're measuring these and measuring these from the beginning, you can demonstrate, hopefully after 3 months and 6 months, a significant improvement. Okay, the planning stage. Think about these things before you go off and do. Okay, then do. You've got your plans together, you've got your processes designed, you've consulted with the people, now go and do it. Train the people and start conducting assessments. When you conduct assessments, if you're consistent in how you conduct them, you will automatically have a ranked list of risks, and the biggest risks will bubble to the top, and those are the things that you need to treat first. Next phase would be to verify that the controls you put in place are working. Are people following the procedures? Are people doing the reconciliations at the end of the month? Are people doing a callback call when somebody phones in to do an encashment and the procedure is that you will call them back? Are they actually doing that? And have you got the evidence? Do you have the records? Because the regulator will ask. The check part of this, and remember this is the management system, the check is, are the risk management objectives being met? So is it working? Is your management system working on this? And the KRIs will often tell you that, because if complaints are going down and if the orders are going up, and some of these are performance indicators, and measure both KRIs and KPIs, it will give you that comfort feeling that you're doing something right, and hopefully you know what that something is. And if you identify weaknesses, then act on it, modify the framework, modify the arrangements, maybe it's additional training. Now, all of this, yes, there will be a lot of information recorded, and that is important. You want to do that efficiently because you want to use it, but you also want to be able to show the regulator that you are doing this. And I'm going to ask Richard maybe to comment on this one, because you know what the regulator asks for. Richard.
Yes, I mean, this slide is slightly out of narrative because it again refers back to the previous session. What I've done is I've taken 2 slides from our previous webinar, and they feature 2 representations of the risks within a firm. One is an Excel listing, and the one on the right is an extract or a screenshot from a sort of specialized enterprise risk management system, or ERM system. Now, if these systems are kept up to date, and I'm using system in the wider sense, then evidencing proof of risk, the existence of a risk management framework to the FCA is relatively trivial. If you're revisiting this once a week, the subject matter is going to be current, and it really will be as straightforward as sending this off to the FCA, and hopefully that will satisfy them. The FCA does usually see evidence of these things through ICAPs, but not all firms are required to produce ICAPs. And again, referring back to CP 1920, they are starting to expect all firms to be able to evidence the existence of a risk framework. And in my view, even the smallest of firms could put together 20 risks and their analysis and the controls that are in place in Excel, just as we've done on the left here. and these ones are then sorted by their final score. So at the top in red you have, if you like, the most pressing risks, which might require a bit more management attention over the coming months. And down the bottom we've got the very smaller green risks, which are effectively fully controlled or were never particularly great in the first place. I should also note that, of course, you know, despite your controls, it may well be that the consequences of risk are the same from pre-treatment to post-treatment. But again, an Excel sheet of this sort, which is geared towards your company, is evidence that you have thought through all the risks, that you have analysed all the risks, that the risks have been discussed and that you are aware of them, which at the lowest level is what the FCA is definitely looking for. And the checking on the controls, going back to previous slides, is part and parcel of compliance monitoring. So you can see how the two fit together. But certainly maintaining this and maintaining it regularly will very, very much ease the disruption of an FCA ask.
Thank you,
Jerry.
Thank you, Richard. In a comment from a customer who had a visit by a regulator, summed it up for me, when she said it made her look good. She said all the regulators' questions she was able to answer, and they were impressed that she had the answers. So make yourself look good. Okay, compliance. We've looked at the arrangements for managing risk. How about the arrangements for managing compliance? Well, no big surprise, very, very similar. In the context, again, start by adding your compliance objectives to that pool of objectives for the organization. And again, scope. Is this compliance for the whole organization? Is it compliance just for one geographical region? Because as we know, in different regions, there are different regulations that will apply. So understand that up front, the size, the magnitude of the task, and the extent to which you're going to ensure compliance. Does that compliance extend to your suppliers? And increasingly, as we found with the GDPR, if you are the data controller and you've outsourced to processors, you still have that obligation to ensure compliance. So be clear on the scope, be clear on the requirements, the obligations, both legal and indeed contractual. And indeed, some organizations will introduce their own obligations on employees and on people that may not necessarily be legal or regulatory, but are equally as important. Policy, again, from governance perspective, it starts with a policy, and policy will state, again, why and what is expected and who's going to manage it and how it's going to be measured. And I would expect in the policy certain commitments from the organization, and maybe certain statements that are probably risk appetite in nature, that maybe non-compliance will not be tolerated. It's no harm to put that in the policy as well, and commitments that maybe non-compliance will be followed up with disciplinary procedure action. You need to identify, again, organization roles and who's responsible and who has the responsibilities for different parts of the compliance requirements. If the function is combined with risk, that can certainly be shared here as well. But as I said, it's not always combined with risk, and indeed some organizations like to keep that separation. The thinking stage, the planning, identify the risks to the program. What could threaten the success of the compliance program, and how do you address these? Think of these up front. It seems negative, but it's just good practice. You try and think, how could this fail, and address it beforehand, so that you've got the measures in place to reduce that possibility and increase the likelihood of success. Let's put it as a positive. Increase the likelihood of success. You need to disaggregate your compliance objectives into objectives for each function, because those objectives will drive, again, your actions later and priorities. One person might be the facilitator, the enabler, the cajoler. And what other word can we use, Richard, for the officer who's going to cause this to happen? But in individual functions, there will be others who will carry some of that responsibility. identify them at this stage. What will need to be done to achieve compliance? It might be training, it might be systems to be put in place, and by systems I mean, in the broadest sense, it could be various processes together that make a system, or it could be a system to record the information. Identify the training requirements and the technology, certainly to be able to record and report on that at the planning stage, before anything more than time is spent. Put that together and you're ready to go and do the do. Conduct the training, ensure people understand why this is important to the organization. Policy needs to be explained to them. No point in having a policy unless everybody understands that policy and is able to implement it and implement the processes, or indeed the changes to processes. Document, and again we go back to, you want to make your life easy for when the regulator comes in and checks. So there will be things you need to document. You will have identified them at the planning stage, and I'm going to ask Richard, with ICAP and ILAA featured here, can these be said to naturally fall out from the generic processes I've been describing?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
As you said earlier up the slideshow, that this was a relatively generic overview of how any firm might embed risk management within their governance and compliance, within its governance and management structures. Now, regulated firms are a subset of all firms and are expected to understand their enterprise risk both at a general level and at certain specific regulatory touch points. Now, two of these, which we've got here, are the ICAP and the ILA. The ICAP dealing with capital adequacy and the ILA dealing with its sister liquidity. Within ICAP, there's the Pillar 2 piece, which is the risk assessment part. And I know these documents focus on financial mitigations of various sorts, but they are going to be natural outputs, or large components of them are going to be natural outputs of a risk framework. So there's a sense that there are two birds with one stone here. We see a lot of ICAPs coming across our desks for review that clearly do not bear much relation to what's happening in a company. I'm sure the FCA is very aware of that when it asks to see ICAPs. Whereas if you've got a risk management framework in place, it naturally translates into these pieces of documentation. And they'd even go further and say that if your firm isn't required through either BIPRU or IFPRU to actually produce an ICAP by the letter of the regulation, I would still be inclined to put together such a document, because again, it shows very easily to the FCA, even if you don't need it, that you are thinking about risk. So if you like, not necessarily a fully blown ICAP, but certainly an ICAP-like document that's a little more unofficial could be very, very helpful. You know, and the way an ICAP is structured also demonstrates again the link between compliance, you know, financial adequacy monitoring, and the risk. You know, the events that could lead to financial stress, which let's face it, are most of the problems that arise in firms. So yes, you know, you've basically got quite an easy win here when it comes to the ICAP, if you've actually got a risk management, a living risk management process embedded in the firm.
Thank you, Richard. Very, very comprehensive answer. And well, I'm convinced. I've always been convinced, and this is to make your life easier. The checking, again, checking that the compliance program is working. And how do you know if it's working? Well, if you are compliant and if you're passing the FCA reviews, but maybe you're recording breaches as well, and maybe they're minor breaches and you're fixing them quickly. But you need to know if your system is working. You can't just plan this together and just go and do it. You have to know after 3 months or 6 months, is it working? Are you achieving the objectives? Otherwise, why did you start it in the first place? And I would be surprised if you didn't find any non-compliances. And in my experience as well, the regulators believe you more if you can show that you've actually taken action to fix things that were not quite perfect before they even came in. It's all right to be honest and show them that. They get a very warm comfort feeling if they know you're fixing it before they come in. Okay. Finally, I'm just going to show you 2 slides here on, call them takeaways if you wish. If you're going to formally embed risk management in your organization, and I do urge you to do that, because it's, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you service your car? I often use the car as a metaphor. You know, nobody says you have to service the car, but hopefully you all do, because you need the car to maybe to get to work or to do your business. So why wouldn't you ensure that it is the right level of oil and tire pressure is correct and the engine is running smoothly? So think of it like that. It's good for you. And start with organizational objectives, because ultimately that's what risk management is about. It's about achieving the objectives by reducing the uncertainty around the achievement of objectives, reducing the risk. You need a policy to guide all actions within the organization. So I've tried to list these out in the order. Policy, again, as we said, the why, the what, the who, the how, and the scope. And if this seems like an awful lot to chew, start with one area in the organization. It doesn't have to be enterprise-wide from day one. Actually, I'd recommend starting with one area, and the best success these are from things that have grown. Have your own risk management objectives. Appetite. The senior management team and the board should agree on how much risk you are willing to take and accept. And as you get better at this and as the controls improve and are stronger, you can take more risk. Again, back to the car. If you've got good brakes, you can go faster. Risk criteria. Agree on how you're going to measure risk and be consistent in that criteria. You can define it day one and you might refine it after a few months, but have one set of criteria. And resources. Now, this is where it often, if you're the person with the responsibility, you have to fight to get the resources. First of all, how much? Well, I would say proportional to what you want to achieve. And assuming they are proportional, then the only argument is how do you justify this in a return on investment? Certainly, anecdotal evidence shows that investment in risk management is at least a wash. That is, it pays for itself. And if you look at what the leading companies, how they stand, those who are formally practicing and are known to do formal risk management on the stock exchange, those companies, in a report I've read, have a valuation 20% higher than those who don't. So to me, that's the ultimate measurement. It's the perception. And why do analysts view them as more valuable? Probably because there's less variability. There's less uncertainty. It's boringly predictable quarter to quarter because they're managing the risk. Identify standards and obligations that apply to your organization and activity. Identify who's going to do what, so the roles and responsibilities, and write it into the job descriptions. Define your risk management process and be consistent in its application. Train people where they need training. I've always been a convert or a believer in training people, and I'm one of the few managers I know that have always spent the training budget because I've always got it back twofold. I would suggest the information you're trying to gather here requires more than an Excel spreadsheet. It requires an information system, and you might say, I would say that, but honestly, Excel spreadsheets, I love them, but you need a system, a database for this. Reporting. Think day one, how do you want to report? Because that'll often drive things that you do. Try get a feel. You can change this obviously, but think of the reporting you're going to require and think of the key risk indicators. You don't need 20 key risk indicators. They'll be different for each business, but think of key risk indicators, whether they're failure indicators or stress indicators or causal indicators or exposure indicators, like interest rates, and start measuring them. Compliance, very quickly, I see we're at 40 minutes, so just a couple of minutes left. What are the objectives of this program? Define the policy, the scope. Is the whole organization? Is it just one particular area of activity? The regulations that apply, the obligations that you have to comply with. The behavioral rules. conduct, if you wish, that you expect, whether they're legal and regulatory or whether it's organizationally defined. The resources you're going to have and who has what role and responsibility, the training required, the monitoring program. And I would say compliance is one thing and you can put processes in place, but you really do need to monitor. You do really need to check that people are following the procedures, that they've understood them correctly. It might be that they're not following them because they didn't understand them. You are responsible. So think how you're going to confirm that that's working. Audit tends to be an annual thing. It might be too late by the time the audit find it, but it's an important element of it. Again, an information system to capture the information and to report on it. The reporting and the performance indicators are all easier if you're gathering the information on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. So I would say thank you guys for listening. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to take questions now, myself and or Richard. I'm just going to check on the, I think I did see one or two coming in. There's two here. I was going to ask for recordings of these along with slides. Yes, recording will be available and slides will be available. I'm going to put up our contact details shortly, just to let us know. That's from Mark. And I'll try and pronounce your name. I'll say Seth. Can you download the presentation? Yes. We will be putting that online and we will send you that information. Anything else? Joseph, did you get any questions there?
There's one here, yes. Within ICAP, would the FCA expect only regulatory risks? Would other risks be out of scope?
I'll let Richard answer that one. Yeah,
I'll pick that one up. Well, no, other risks wouldn't be out of scope. This harks back to what I was saying a couple of slides up when you asked me about ICAP. Really, regulated activities of a firm are a subset of all the firm's activities, and risks in all its activities will have an effect on the regulatory part, in inverted commas. You know, and running a company, whether it's regulated or not, there are universal rules and laws that have to be obeyed. You know, sort of AML is relevant to all firms under UK law, bribery, etc., etc. And these all endure risks within a firm. A firm should have you know, measures and controls in place to head off any possibility of being used for money laundering, etc., etc. So really, the ICAP should cover the whole firm. You know, it's not a case that you can put up a regulatory perimeter, because as far as risk is concerned, that perimeter is porous. So I would, with an ICAP, I would try and cover the enterprise as a whole. You know, possibly some areas in more detail depending on the importance of that particular business piece. A quick related question here. How would you suggest getting people to report mistakes and errors? Jerry, do you have any ideas? I've got a view myself, but...
That's the question is I see two elements to that question. How do you get them to report it? So it could be that they put the hand up and report in the first place, that they have the motivation. So I'll address that part of it. And I would say, I've seen in organizations in the aviation sector, they use the phrase just culture quite a lot, because they want people to put their hand up and say, I screwed up, or, you know, I made a mistake, or this isn't right. Now, it might be whistleblowing on themselves, it might be whistleblowing on somebody else, but what you want people to report. So you're not going to, they won't report a second time if they get beaten up for reporting it, for the honesty. So it's finding that balance. And I would always say, look, better you report it than I find it. So if you report it, I'm not going to discipline you. But let's fix it, because usually the cause is a poor process. So just culture, I would say, to get them to report it. And if the other part of the how is, how do you record it? How do you store this information? I go back to a guy called Michael Barnier, who wrote a book on the financial systems and the financial crisis. And he said if the banks had been recording the near misses, That's what he described them as, the near misses. They would have seen the crisis coming much sooner. And because very often one near miss is not going to tell you that there's a thunderstorm coming, but if you see lots of red flags and they're increasing in number, think of the key risk indicators. And incidents, near misses could be one of your key risk indicators. If your errors are increasing rather than decreasing, then guess what? Something significant is probably going to happen. How about you, Richard? How would you suggest people report? I mean, have you seen?
Oh, I'm in agreement with what you said. I bring the near misses down to a far more localized and small company level, because we always go with a separate register for actual incidents and a separate one for near misses. And what we've tried to do within Complyport, and it's our advice to clients as well, is that near misses really show that someone within the firm noticed something and they prevented it happening before it was too late. So from that point of view, it's not quite, look, I'm a hero, I prevented this, but you actually praise or set up a sort of an environment in which people can point out deficiencies which almost occurred. The one that seems to be more fun for everyone at the moment is in Complyport is examples of malicious emails. We get quite a lot of them in and we do record them, and some of them are certainly noteworthy in their use of the English language. But these, nevertheless, this maintains an awareness that these things can come in. You click on them and you can let pretty awful things down into your systems. It's far better that we have this near-miss reporting regime in place because it maintains the awareness. So I think a near-miss register which arises or gives rise to praise to people for bringing deficiencies to our attention is definitely a good way to play it.
You've reminded me, this time last year, coming up to Christmas, one of our customers, well, after Christmas, they reported that in the days running up to Christmas, they had 3 attempts, and I'm not going to give the 3 examples, but of somebody trying to, I suppose, financially rob them, you could say, through identity theft. And one of them was that they pretended to be a customer, sounded fairly genuine, and because the individual in the organization followed the callback procedure, because they suspected this isn't in character. They'd received this email from a person instructing them to pay money into a certain account, and they called back, picked up the phone and called the number in the account and said, just wanted to ask you about that email. And the person said, I never sent an email. And this was reported, and after Christmas, this and 2 other, let's say, similar events to the whole organization, and the people who followed the procedure the way they should have were actually praised for their alertness. You know, in the week where if they'd fallen into it, you might say, well, you know, it was very busy and they could be forgiven for, you know, succumbing under pressure. But I thought that was a good example of praising people. You could say, well, you're praising them just for doing their job, but it's reinforcing, isn't it? It's reinforcing that control and at the same time telling people, look, it does happen. And this is why we have these procedures in place. So that was good. Guys, we're probably gone over our time, so I'm just going to show the last slide. If people do want copies of the presentation, if you email either myself or Richard at either of these addresses, we'll happily send you a copy of the presentation and a link to the recording.
Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, everybody, for listening in today, and special thanks to our 2 presenters for really an excellent series of insights into risk adequacy over the last weeks. If you do have any questions or inquiries, please do address them to the 2 presenters. We look forward to more of the same in a future series on risk in the new year. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.